Hi, I'm James.
And I'm Anthony.
And this is Words and Numbers. You know, it's kind of feeling like springtime out here. I know that the entire East Coast is under about 3 feet of snow, but it's 72 degrees here and I got all the doors and windows open.
Yeah, that's enough of that. I don't need to hear that, James. I've got the wood stove cranking. It's about 5 degrees outside right now.
I'm glad that we finally found the thing that I can say that pisses you off.
Right.
What's new and exciting in your world this week, Ant?
One of our listeners sent me an article saying that Ireland is considering what's called in the article a universal basic income. But when you read the description, the universal part is not so much. This is a basic income that would apply to artists. On the one hand, you could see all sorts of potentially good things coming from this. It promotes art and more people can get involved in art who otherwise wouldn't have been able to develop their talents because it's hard to make a living as an artist. And you can make all of these arguments. However, there are some serious unintended consequences that will arise from this. And I'm not saying that the unintended consequences are better or worse. I'm simply saying they're there and they have to be considered. First, providing a universal basic income to artists necessarily means that people are going to become artists who would not otherwise have become artists. And of course, our thoughts go to the talented people. These are people who would not have become great artists were it not for the UBI. But there's also going to be a tremendous number of people who aren't so talented, who are going to now feel more incented to pursue their art because of the basic income.
I'd do it in a half a second.
Yeah, I think there you have to think about the probabilities. Absent a UBI, one is more likely to become an artist if one is more talented. That is, the probability of having talent given that you become an artist is greater than the probability of having talent given that you didn't become an artist. All of that in the absence of a UBI. So necessarily, encouraging more people to become artists will, on average, attract lesser talented people. And this is going to cause a decline in the average quality of the art. And look, I have no way to judge your quality as a musician, but I can observe that the market has said that your quality as a musician is less than your quality as a professor. If that weren't the case, you'd already be a musician.
Yeah, and I've told you this joke before, right? Two economists walk down the street and there's someone playing a violin on the street corner. One economist looks to the other and says, "I always wanted to play the violin." The second economist said, no, you didn't.
No, you didn't. Why? Because you aren't. This is the first thing. There's going to be more people attracted to become artists. The second consequence is going to be an average decline in the quality of art. And then there's an interesting third unintended consequence, and that's a form of regulatory capture. All of a sudden, people in other fields
That's right.
are going to start claiming that they're actually artists and that their field should be covered. I give you as an example, you're in my field of lecturing to college students. You have to get up on a stage, you have to be a good orator, you have to entertain your audience. That classifies me as an artist.
Well, how is it that you can do all those things if entertaining people is one of them? You don't entertain anybody.
I entertain people. You just annoy them.
You yell at people. I'm going to go back to the economists here. They'll tell you that if you want more of something, subsidize it. So we're going to get more art. We're also going to get more sloth because now that's subsidized too.
I would say you're not going to get more art. What you're going to get are more artists.
That's right.
What they're doing here is short-circuiting the one benefit of a universal basic income. That is, they've removed the universal part. The benefit of a universal basic income is that because everybody gets it, regardless of who you are, how much you earn, what you do, it has minimal effect on people's behaviors. It's a very light touch on the economy. What Ireland is suggesting here is not a light touch at all.
This sounds like something that's destined for foolishness. I suspect that artist guilds will crop up claiming to know the difference between artists and non-artists.
Right.
And
They'll become the gatekeepers of the basic income.
if you doubt this, tell me why florists have a guild.
Right.
You and I both ended up with Ireland today. We've got something from County Cork in the south. Fishermen. They ran into a problem with, of all things, the Russian Navy. The Russian Navy was going to do some exercises, the kind that exercise everyone when they do it.
Right.
They were going to do some exercises off the southern coast of Ireland. And the fishermen said, excuse me, that's where we make our living. And here's where it gets weird. They went to the embassy and they talked to the Russians, and the Russians talked amongst themselves and came back and said, okay, we'll do it further out.
Really?
Not what you expected, was it?
Not at all. How about that?
It wasn't at all what I expected either.
And that is how civilized people behave.
Yeah, that's right. And that leads to some other questions about Russian behavior elsewhere and our reaction to that behavior. If people can be reasonable about one thing, they are very capable of being reasonable about other things. At the end of this story, we'll put a link in the show notes for you. There's this guy, Alan Carlton. He says a bunch of things that I swear to God I've said probably in the last year. He says, we're all human beings and all anyone wants to do is make a living. Everyone has mortgages. They have to be paid. Follow the fish and make a living. That's all we want to do.
Right.
There is this universality. And every time I go to the developing countries of the world, this is what I hear. We just want to make a living. We want our children to be safe. We gave a lecture not too long ago, and this came up in my portion of it, and I got a bunch of emails saying, well, holy hell, that's right. Like it was surprising somehow. So kind of a nice thing to think about. Of course, now we have to go to the foolishness of the week. I will warn you that email you're always asking for, it's about to start coming in droves. I want to talk about a North Carolina resident, Chad Carlswell, 38 years old. Severe kidney disease. His kidneys are functioning at 4%, which means you're in for dialysis or you will die. The people on dialysis, and I've known more than a few, they have all told me that this is a deeply unpleasant thing that they have to do regularly.
Yeah.
It buys them a couple of days where they feel really good, and then they start deteriorating again when their blood becomes polluted by things they eat and what have you. And there's almost no way around that. If this could be controlled in any other way, trust me, it would be. And here we have Chad Carlswell, who has been told recently that he is no longer on the organ transplant list.
He was on it and now is taken off.
Yeah, because he will not get a vaccine for COVID.
Oh, wow.
Right. And you see that we're actually playing with pretty high stakes over here. Not what I expected to hear. I kind of expected to hear that if you're on the transplant list, you'd be bending over backwards to do everything you needed to do to make that happen. Usually we look at people who are morbidly obese or who drink too much and we say to them, your behaviors must change. That has never been seen as some sort of imposition. Why? Because kidneys are precious and there are so few of them. And we have to go with the people who we think have the best chance at surviving.
This is a concerning contradiction because the whole push behind mandating the vaccine was we need to save lives. Granted, there's some increased probability of dying of COVID if you don't have the COVID vaccine, but what they're doing is saying, okay, you don't choose the extra X% decrease in probability of death due to COVID, therefore we're going to sentence you to death by not giving you a kidney.
Well, sooner or later it will end that way.
That's astounding.
I think it's astonishing all the way around. But if you can be told that you can't have a transplant because you're an alcoholic and you don't stop drinking, I think you can be told that you can't have a transplant for every other behavioral reason. Why? Because there's somebody in pretty good shape who can live a very normal life if they could have that kidney.
I think there's an important difference in magnitude here. If you're an alcoholic, this is directly damaging the kidney. There's a high probability of that happening. In fact, if you are an alcoholic, you're going to continue. The probability of it damaging the kidney is virtually 100%. We're talking about an event dying of COVID that is in the fractions of a percent. If that's enough for the state to come in and say, look, you must do this, otherwise we're not going to give you a kidney, well, good God, it opens up all kinds of other things.
Let's go back to your first assertion there because I think it's probably incorrect. You're talking about the probability of dying from COVID in the healthy population.
That's true. Fair enough.
This guy might be orders of magnitude greater than that. I suspect he is. He's digging in his heels here on principle. But boy, I just don't understand the principle. The details of our lives matter when we make these decisions. It's like me saying, no one should ever steal. Well, so stipulated until my children are starving.
Right.
Then I'm going to steal. Human life is very contextual, and there are very few things that are universally true. That's not to say there aren't any things there are. But that list pales in comparison to the list of other things.
Wherever you might come down on this particular issue, the fact is this issue arises precisely because we ask the government to be involved in healthcare. The government brings with it tax dollars it can make available, but it also brings with it its control. To get more Ant and James, buy a copy of our excellent book, Cooperation and Coercion. You can find the paper and electronic versions on Amazon and the audio version on Audible. If you'd like to support Words and Numbers, make your way over to patreon.com/wordsandnumbers, where you can contribute to our podcast-making habits.
Today, Ant, I was hoping we could talk about the famine that's on its way to Afghanistan. We tend not to pay that much attention to Afghanistan since we had that very ill-defined
Police action?
Withdrawal when we watched on TV as the Americans headed out in airplane after airplane. We've got about 23 million Afghans facing extreme levels of hunger. That's different from famine because there are nearly 9 million at risk of famine. It's happening just as winter sets in. The political structure has deteriorated into nothing.
This becomes an example for people who say you don't need a government at all. I can buy that argument provided that your private sector institutions have stepped up and are developed. But I don't know that there's any country on the planet that has a private sector developed to the point that it can, in totality, replace the organizational structure of government, much less so a country like Afghanistan. You take away the governmental organization and things are just going to fall apart.
And we tend to forget that Afghanistan hasn't always been a basket case like it is now. There were times in the past when it was just fine. But when you've got an appreciation for the sweep of history, this business in Afghanistan just doesn't seem that crazy. We could also talk about Venezuela and how they ended up not having enough food. We could also talk about North Korea, and it's the same story. Here's the weird part with Afghanistan. They still, to this point, have food. There is food in the stores, but people have no money. The next thing to happen will be that there won't be any food in the stores at all. Because if there's no market for it, who in his right mind would send it there?
Right. You're talking about the problem with the breakdown of government in Afghanistan and also Venezuela. But this is happening to a greater or lesser extent worldwide because of the pandemic. When we shut down our economy and similar developed countries shut down their economies, it created, and we're feeling it now, shortages. So you go to the store and there are certain things that aren't there. But take that effect and increase it by orders of magnitude. For example, sub-Saharan Africa or in India, the UN anticipates that 130 million people currently are on the brink of starvation that weren't prior to the pandemic. The number of malnourished children under 5 is up by 2.5 million just in the past 2 years. And these are numbers that were all trending downward for the past 30 years.
The problem of starvation was looking like it was going to be a thing of the past.
Yes, it really was.
And now it's going to be very hard for a while until we can resume the previous trajectory, which we very likely will when everything reverts to normal. But you've got to think long and hard about how far away from normal we are right now, because here in the United States, I'm not embarrassed to tell you that I get frustrated when I go to the store and I can't buy something that I went to the store to buy.
Yep.
It doesn't happen often. Surely we've had worse problems than we have right this second. The early part of the pandemic sticks out in my mind as a real issue. That was when things were really bad. And yet, when I go to the store and they don't have one thing that I want, I'm angry. I go to another store, the whole bit.
It's not something we're used to.
No, and when I see these Afghans, I get a little embarrassed for my own behavior.
Mm-hmm.
Honestly, I have no cause to complain here. We have very soft life here. Maybe we do without one or two things at a grocery store. But beyond that, the reach of the shortages doesn't really end up in my front yard.
It's not something that leaves you wondering if your kids are going to survive into the next month.
No, and that's the question that I see Afghanis asking themselves right now. What will I do with my children? Is there any place I can go to get anything? You think about North Korea, and there were persistent rumors for a decade or two that people were engaged in cannibalism there. Now, things have gotten better in the last 8 or 10 years in North Korea, but my God, even that there could be a rumor of such a thing is unfathomable.
That's the maddening thing, that these numbers were looking so good for so long. We talked about it, 3 years ago? For the first time in human history, the number of people living in extreme poverty had dropped below 10%. And that's despite the fact that there's far more people on the planet now than there's ever been before.
Right.
And this pandemic and our response to it has really thrown a wrench into not just our economy, but the global economy. And I think people are starting to realize you can't just turn this thing off and then expect to turn it back on and have everything fine. My guess is, looking at what happened in 2008 and looking at the Great Depression, I would not at all be surprised that it's going to be 10 years before things get back to where they were prior to the pandemic.
And here we have two different things, right? There's what we had prior to the pandemic, and then there's what we would have that people might be able to live reasonably well. And neither of them is going to happen anytime soon. People don't pay a whole lot of attention to what it really means to shut down an economy.
Mm-hmm.
We in the United States, for the most part, can withstand that. The countries of Western Europe, even Central Europe, sure. But the developing countries out there, the countries that were just barely getting by, now they have nothing.
The thing that people seem not to understand about the economy is that in a lot of ways, it's a circular argument. You talked about there being food in the grocery stores in Afghanistan, but nobody has any money. Well, the fact is I don't have money if I don't have a job, and I don't have a job if no one is buying whatever my employer is selling. And if the people don't have money, they can't buy what the employer is selling, which means I can't get paid, which means I can't buy stuff. And you could see how this becomes this circular argument. And this is the problem with shutting the thing down. This wheel is turning. You stop it, and now it's going to take a huge effort to get the thing moving again.
We've been left with a set of circumstances here that I don't know if you can actually fix them.
Well,
I guess time heals all things.
Yeah.
If you have a functioning economy for a very long time, it's going to get around or through these problems. Then maybe you can set me straight with whatever numbers you have. I would hazard to guess that Afghanistan is a decade away from where it was 5 months ago, 6 months ago. And that wasn't that good either.
Yeah, that wouldn't surprise me at all, particularly given I think the U.S. is the better part of a decade away from where we were.
And if you think about Afghanistan, this was a terrible regime that we're looking back on saying, yes, it was better then.
Yep.
There might be nothing anybody can do. And that's not the kind of thing we enjoy saying, but there are some problems that are so dire you can't solve them.
And here comes, I can't believe I'm going to do this, I'm going to say something seriously positive about government. And that is the way out of this, the way to get this cycle moving again, is to start out with the rule of law and property rights. As long as those two things exist, entrepreneurs feel comfortable to take a gamble and start up something, even though they have no consumers. They say, okay, this is something people are going to like, I'm going to bring it to market and we're going to see what happens. That kind of thing only happens in an environment in which you're comfortable that whatever you invest, someone isn't going to come along and take it away later, and you're comfortable that everybody understands the rules of the game and will be held to them. Yeah, the market can step in and do those sorts of things in a developed country that already has the tradition of property rights and the rule of law. But in the environment you're talking about in Afghanistan, I think the market's going to be hard-pressed to fill those roles. You really do need a strong and good government.
I want to get back to that exact point, given the three countries I've mentioned. So first it was Afghanistan, then it was North Korea, then it was Venezuela. I think I could safely predict that no one of those three countries will ever get anywhere near what you just said. And there goes your problem. When you have misbehaved as a nation, I'm referring obviously to the ruling class, when you've misbehaved so badly that you can't tend after the domestic issues that you have to tend after, Nobody's coming in with any kind of investment until you prove that it'll be safe. Everything I've ever seen from those three regimes leads me to believe nothing will ever be safe there.
Let's take Venezuela as an example here. Under Chavez, they nationalized the oil industry. These were private companies that were owned by stockholders, and Chavez government comes along and says, this now all belongs to the Venezuelan people. If you're a stockholder, you've invested in this thing. You're just out the money. They've thrown you out, and all of the assets belong to the government. How likely are you when another entrepreneur comes along and says, okay, the key to success here in Venezuela is getting a business started. I need some seed capital to get things moving. How likely are you to put up your money? Right? You're going to say, forget it. I'm going to invest here. And if things work out, the government's likely to take control of the thing and kick me out a second time.
Most people think it was Chavez. It wasn't. It was President Carlos Andrés Perez back in 1976.
That far back, really?
76. And at this point, analysts estimate that as much as $100 billion was embezzled from the oil companies. After nationalization,
nationalization, right. So the government takes it over in the name of the people, and then the politicians take the money in the name of their own pockets.
It's not working, right? Oil is not coming out of the ground. However, Venezuela has the most oil of any country in the entire world. And think about how small Venezuela looks when you compare it to, China or Russia or the United States. It's tiny, and yet it has the biggest oil reserve, which means that everybody in Venezuela should be pretty well off, if not rich. But they are neither of those two things.
You're talking about that, and it's reminding me, my son, who, as many young teenage boys are, is into sports cars. And he was saying that one of the oil-producing countries on the Arabian Peninsula, apparently they're so wealthy that you go out and you buy a Lamborghini, you drive it around, and when the thing breaks down, you just leave it inside the road, you go buy another one.
God, I got to go hang out there.
Yeah, apparently they've got junkyards that are just chock full of Lamborghinis and Ferraris and this sort of thing.
That doesn't sound right at all.
That's the level of wealth that Venezuela could be at if simply their government behaved differently.
Well, I think we can go much further than that, right? Because the average person, indeed our average listener, for that matter, us, we really can't comprehend throwing a Lamborghini away. We can't even comprehend buying one.
Yep.
However, here in the United States, where we are both sitting, today I'm going to throw away a bunch of food. How did we get here?
Yeah.
Throw away food? That doesn't seem like something to do. And yet, I'll go through the fridge because I have a cold box inside my house that lengthens the life of leftover foods. I'm going to go through the fridge, I'm going to pull things out that are questionable, and I'm going to get rid of them. I'm not even going to give them to the dog, right? Because I don't want to risk sickness. We have about a 1-week tolerance on leftovers here. We throw food away, Aunt. People are starving to death in Afghanistan. Meanwhile, I'm going to go in my kitchen and throw food away. I just don't know how to square these things. I'm not the kind of guy that says, look, the West wastes X number of pounds of food a year. Afghanistan needs it. That's a nonsense argument, right? There's really nothing we can do as individuals to help Afghanistan at all. But just look at the difference. They're starving for anything, and we're so picky, we're going to throw a bunch of stuff away today.
What you're pointing to is being grateful, being thankful for what you do have. The fact that you can walk up to the wall and turn a knob and it gets warm.
It's actually amazing.
Yeah, many people on the planet have to go gather firewood and make a fire, still to this day.
I had a realization a couple of days ago. I walked into the other room and I lit a candle. No big deal, right? Something that you do every now and again. But it occurred to me that if I were left to my own devices, meaning to say if I had to live a primitive life, there's no way I could make a fire.
Right.
I'm dimly aware
that it's possible.
I'm dimly aware that you can make
Right.
a fire, and I know it involves rocks that you hit together to make a spark, but I wouldn't have the first idea what kind of rocks or how you got this to work. I would be a dead man were it not for a Bic lighter.
Right.
And we build sequentially over time on what generations before us made. We get all the best of it here. Other places get nothing. They could have the best of it because we would surely export it to them, but they won't let us. And that's authoritarianism. You get an authoritarian government, and they say something like, look, you people are all just going to have to live with it. These people will take humanitarian shipments that come in, but if you really want to change the lot of people who are just about starving, start exporting the culture. What you really want is American television and a McDonald's, because you get a couple of things like that into a place that's been resistant to things like that. In the medium term, it's going to make a gigantic difference.
We have this tendency here to resort to economic sanctions. I suppose that's a better solution than going to war, but it's not the best solution. It ends up hurting the people. It doesn't have much of an effect on the government. In fact, the intent is to hurt the people so much that they rise up against the government. That's just horrible. You're using human suffering to political ends. That's what economic sanctions end up doing.
And it doesn't really end up doing that, right? And I'll give you Cuba as a pretty good example.
Sure.
What, Fidel Castro outlived 7 United States presidents? Let's face it, the blockade didn't work. And I think you have to come to terms with that globally. It almost never works. It does bring a form of misery to the target country, but that misery, like you say, is almost exclusively experienced by regular people. Americans forget that the people in these parts of the world want exactly the same things that you want. They want to have a job that pays the bills. They want to raise their children. They want things to be relatively peace and quiet. They want to go to the soccer game. Until that last one, I understand everything perfectly. If you were with me a second ago thinking, yeah, I probably couldn't start a fire from scratch either, well, then stick with me, because I don't know what I would do if there were no food.
I wrote an academic paper several years ago comparing the size of government to the UN's Human Development Index, which is a number that, roughly speaking, measures quality of life of people in a country. And I found something fascinating. It appears to be the case that the Human Development Index, the quality of life, rises the larger government gets relative to the size of the economy, up to a point. And beyond that point, the Human Development Index actually falls as government gets larger, which kind of fits with what I was saying earlier when I said some nice things about government in reference to Afghanistan. And that is, it seems that government does have a role to play. Coercion has a role to play, provided it's done well, in getting that economic ball rolling, in jump-starting the economy. But once the economy's moving, it needs to get out of the way, because if it remains in place, it simply becomes a hindrance.
But you're not going to have a whole lot of luck talking to politicians like that.
No, they'll happily grab on to that first statement, that you need the government to get the ball rolling.
Yes, it's the second one that get every time.
And you find this with poor John Maynard Keynes. I disagree with much of his work, but nonetheless, I think he's gotten a bad rap here because politicians grabbed on to the first sentence in his prescription, which was, when you're in recession, the government needs to spend more money. That's what they trumpet, and that's what they say, well, look, the economists even support us that we need to spend more money, completely ignoring his next sentence, that when the economy gets moving, the government needs to decrease government spending. That part they never hear.
Right. Funny how that always happens. I also think there's a role for government here. I tend not to ever say that out loud because I don't think there are legitimate roles for government much anywhere you might look. But if you have a starving population, you best get your act together. Mm-hmm. I don't know how people with power can look at the human misery feet away from where they sit and don't do anything. And yet, everywhere we look at these authoritarian regimes, they do exactly nothing. When Americans start saying things like, well, we should try socialism, get a good long look, because that's what these places all said.
Socialism at its root assumes that stuff that we need falls out of the sky. Or if it isn't falling out of the sky, people will behave in an ideal way to bring things about.
You can't find an example in a socialist country where people had enough food by the time the socialism got its hooks all the way in.
It's kind of interesting, isn't it? One of the big things that the founders brought to the table was the idea of a government designed around the reality of human beings and the reality of their incentives. And so they give us this system of checks and balances where power is supposed to bump up against power and to counteract each other. And yet the socialists miss that when they think about economics. They don't think about the reality of human beings and the reality of incentives. They're thinking about ideal people and how ideal people might behave.
And they throw human nature right out the window. If you have a keen appreciation for the structure of the United States Constitution, which you get from reading the Constitution itself and from reading through the Federalist essays in support of adopting that Constitution, what you realize is that the American government was designed to be inefficient.
It's supposed to be inefficient.
That is absolutely a feature and not a bug, because when you get hyper-efficient government, what you get are totalitarians.
Yep.
When the government can execute on anything it wants at the moment it decides to do it, that's totalitarianism. Even if it doesn't run badly in the first instance, it will always run badly down the line, and it won't take long. We want to make everybody's lives easier. Government should be doing that, but government's not really powerful enough to do that, at least not directly, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And when we look to Afghanistan, we see human beings starving to death.
And we've said good things about government. We've said bad things about government. And I think it's important to underline here that when we talk about government having a role, that role is limited to basically those two things of protecting property rights and ensuring the rule of law. That's it.
Jefferson said in the Declaration, a government exists to secure your rights, period. And if it doesn't, you can alter or abolish it and replace it with anything you see fit to replace it with. Notice that Jefferson never said a word about anarchy. You can replace one government with another one, but you can't replace it with nothing. And that makes perfect sense if you know Jefferson, because what did he say? Governments exist to secure your rights.
You've mentioned a couple of interesting examples. If the government does too little along those lines, you get Afghanistan. If it does too much along those lines, you get North Korea. If it does what it's supposed to do along those lines, you get things like the United States and Germany and France.
And Scotland, Australia, right? The list is relatively long. The minute you say this, of course, people are going to send us a bunch of hate mail about anarchy. There is no space here for anarchy. Maybe there is down the road when we've all gotten better at things. I doubt it, because that's exactly the kind of argument that Karl Marx made about communism.
That's interesting.
That it would just result down the road. And when we pick on Marx as well, we should. It doesn't appear down the road because Karl Marx did not understand human nature. Anarchists also don't understand human nature. They don't understand it from a very different place, but nonetheless, they don't understand it. On that happy note, destined to yield hate mail by the bucketful, I think it's probably best that we stop. We'll talk about something more uplifting next week on Words and Numbers, but in the meantime, you can follow us on Twitter. Handles are, as always, in the show notes. You can, in fact, send us email. See it? I'm going to say it myself. You can send us email at wordsandnumberspodcast.org. Is that? No, at Gmail.
He can't even get it right. It's wordsandnumberspodcast@gmail.com. If it's hate mail, in the subject line, put attention, James.
Yeah, go yourself. Anyway, as we were saying. Oh, right. Having told Ant to go yourself, I now get to tell all of you that you should be nice to each other. Just a little bit more than you've been. We're all getting a little hostile, what with the third variant of the virus of indeterminate origin. And
I want to throw in something here. A couple of episodes ago, we mentioned a company that produces a mask.
That's right.
That actually doesn't mask. It looks like a mask, but you could breathe through it and all of that.
The email that we got on that was actually kind of epic.
Actually, I got a number of emails asking me, what is this company? If you really want to know, you can go back to whatever episode it was, 256 in the show notes. There's a link there. Do what you will with it.
And Ant is not telling you right now the name of the company because he's so old that he's forgotten.
No, I haven't forgotten
all kinds of things.
I just don't want to step in that.
We don't offer product endorsements unless we use the product and the company pays us.
That's right. We are for sale.
Anyway, be nice to each other. It's worth it, and we'll see you in a week. Take care of yourself, Ant.
See you next week, James.